There is a moment at every farm sale when the auctioneer reaches a lot that is not machinery and not tools and not anything anybody came for, and the whole field goes slightly flat. Lot 230 was a pair of tongs, not blacksmith's tongs, lifting tongs, the kind a mill uses to pick up steel plate, and they were 11 feet tall, standing on end, and weighed 6,000 pounds, which is 3 tons, and they were leaning against a hay rack in a field outside Chillicothe, Missouri, on a bright, cold Saturday in November, with about 200 people walking past them all morning. They look exactly like a pair of pliers. That is the whole of it visually, and it is why people stopped to photograph them and did not stop to bid. 2 curved cast steel arms crossing at a pin, jaws at the bottom, a lifting eye at the top, and if you put a person next to them for scale, the effect is genuinely comic. Everybody in that field owned a pair of pliers. Everybody's weighed about half a pound and lived in a drawer. These were the same object at 90 times the size, and there is no way to look at them and not smile. Ardell Buskirk paid $35. He was 46 and ran a 4-man salvage and demolition outfit out of a yard north of town, which matters because it is the reason he was the only person there who was not looking at a novelty. The laugh came from a man in a green quilted jacket near the ring, and it was good-natured. And what he said was that Ardell had just bought the world's biggest pair of pliers and would need the world's biggest toolbox. That got the field. It is a genuinely funny line, and it went round in about a minute. The sale itself is worth standing in for a minute because of what else was in that field. It was a full farm and industrial consignment auction. 4 rings, about 200 people at the peak, and maybe 300 lots. The good stuff was at the top of the field. 2 tractors, a skid steer, a grain auger, a flatbed trailer. That is where the money was, and that is where the crowd was. The tongs were at the bottom, in the 3rd ring, among what auctioneers call the iron. The iron is everything that came off a farm or a shop and is too heavy to be small tools and too odd to be machinery. Anvil stands, chain, broken implements, a hydraulic ram out of something, 200 feet of pipe. Most of it goes for scrap price, and everybody knows it. The tongs stood against a hay rack with a lot number wired to the pin. 11 feet of cast steel, leaning back at an angle, with the jaws open at the bottom about 2 feet apart. People photographed them all morning. That is a real detail, and it is in the auctioneer's own account. He said he had never had a lot photographed that much and sell for that little, and that if he had $1 for every picture, he would have beaten the hammer price. Here is why they photograph and do not bid. A thing that looks like a familiar object at an unfamiliar size is funny. It short-circuits something. You see it, you laugh, you take a picture to show somebody, and the taking of the picture completes the transaction. You have got what you came for. Nobody photographs a lathe. And the joke actively works against the object, because once a thing is funny, it is very hard to also be serious about it. You cannot easily stand in a field and think carefully about jaw geometry while the man next to you is holding his phone up and grinning. Ardell Buskirk did not photograph them. He looked at the stamp on the arm. And then he walked away and looked at the tractors for 40 minutes, and then he came back and looked at the stamp again. That is the whole of what he did differently, and he is dull about it when asked. The bidding took 11 seconds. The auctioneer opened at $200, which is roughly scrap value for 3 tons of cast steel, and got nothing which is normal for the iron. He came to 100, then 50. At 35, a hand went up, and it was over. The man in the green quilted jacket made his remark about the world's biggest toolbox, and the field laughed, and the ring moved on to 200 feet of pipe. Now the part that is easy to miss. The lot after the tongs was a pallet of chain and shackles. 4 tons of assorted rigging, most of it modern, all of it certified, with tags. It made $2,800. Same field, same crowd, same 11 minutes. The rigging sold for 80 times the tongs, and the rigging does the same job, worse, and puts a hole in everything it touches. Nobody in that field thought that was strange, and it is not strange, because the chain had tags and a rating and a place in a catalog, and everybody knew what it was for. The tongs had a lot number and a stamp saying 2 inches and looked like a cartoon. The auctioneer's clerk wrote the buyer's number down, and that was the end of it. One more thing about that morning, and Ardell brought it up himself. The tongs had been at a sale before. If you've made it this far into Ardell Buskirk's story, hit subscribe, because what happens next is the part I've been waiting to tell you. There is a chalk mark on the inside of the left arm, a different auction house from 2016, which means somebody bought them once already and then sent them on. He has never traced who, and he says he does not want to. What he takes from it is that the joke has been made at least twice, in at least 2 fields, and that both times it worked. Now, what lifting tongs actually are, because the mechanism is the story, and it is one of the most elegant things in any yard. A crane can only pull straight up. That is all a hook does. So the entire problem of moving heavy, flat things is the problem of getting a reliable grip on something that has no handles, and the 2 usual answers are to drill it, which ruins it, or to sling it, which requires the load to have somewhere for a sling to go. A steel plate lying flat on the ground has neither. Tongs solve it with geometry. The 2 arms cross at a central pin, so they are a lever. The lifting eye is above the pin and the jaws are below it, and when the crane takes the weight, the pull at the eye tries to close the arms, and the arms squeeze the plate, which means the grip is generated by the load itself. A heavier plate does not make the tongs more likely to drop it. A heavier plate makes them grip harder in exact proportion forever, with no ratchet, no lock, no hydraulics, and no power of any kind. There is nothing to fail, because there is nothing there. It is 2 pieces of steel and a pin. Set the plate down, and the load comes off the eye, and the jaws open on their own. Anybody who has used a pair of ice tongs or a sugar tongs already knows this in their hands. What is startling is that the same trick works, unchanged, at 3 tons, and it works at 300. So the tongs were not a novelty. They were a serious piece of lifting gear. And Ardell Buskirk knew exactly what they were, and he still nearly did not bid, because of the number stamped into the arm. 2 inches. A pair of tongs is cut for a thickness. The jaw gap, the arm curve, and the geometry are all sized around a particular plate, and these were made for 2-inch plate, and the tolerance on that is not generous. Give them something an inch thick, and the jaws close past their working angle, and the grip goes wrong. Give them 3 inches, and it will not go on. 2-inch structural plate is not a thing anybody rolls much of anymore. The mill those tongs came from had closed in 1998, and the reason it closed is the reason the tongs were in a field in Missouri. The market for what it made went away. Modern structural work uses lighter sections in clever arrangements, and where you would once have used a 2-inch plate, you now use a welded box or a rolled section half the weight. So he had bought, for $35, a beautifully engineered tool sized for a material that had gone out of fashion before his own children were born. That is the trap, and everybody who understood the stamp understood the trap, which was perhaps 6 people in that field. He spent the winter thinking about it. And what he arrived at is so obvious in hindsight that he has said he is faintly embarrassed it took him 4 months, and it is this: nobody rolls much 2-inch plate anymore. An enormous amount of it is already standing up. Every bridge, tank, crane rail, head frame, lock gate, mill building, and grain terminal put up in this country between about 1890 and 1975 is made of exactly that material, in exactly those thicknesses, and every single one of them is either being maintained, altered, or taken down right now. Ardell Buskirk was in the demolition business. His entire working life was spent taking apart structures made of the one material his 3-ton novelty was cut for, and he had been doing it, like everybody else in that trade, by burning holes in the plate and shackling through them. Here is why that matters more than it sounds. When you cut a hole in a plate to lift it, you have made a decision about that plate. It is now scrap. It cannot be reused as structure, because a burned hole through a structural member is a defect and no engineer will sign off on it, so anything you lift that way goes for its weight in melt. 2-inch plate in melt is worth about $190 a ton. 2-inch plate certified sound, cut to size and resold for reuse, is worth between $800 and $1,400 a ton depending on the grade and the paperwork, and there is a real market for it, because new plate of that thickness has a lead time and a price that makes salvage attractive. The difference between those two numbers is the entire business, and it turns on whether you put a hole in it. The Tongs do not put a hole in it. That is what he bought for $35, and he did not fully understand it until February. The first job was a grain terminal on the river taken down in the spring, and it was the kind of job his outfit had done 20 times. The difference was that instead of burning lifting holes, the crew set the tongs on each plate as it was released, and the crane took it away whole and undamaged, and it went on a trailer instead of in a skip. 240 tons came off that structure. At melt, it would have been about $45,000. Sold as reusable certified plate, it came to $196,000, and the extra cost of doing it that way was some crane time, a slower schedule, and the $35. Take one plate off that grain terminal and watch it all the way, because the whole business is in a single lift. It is a wall plate, 2 inches thick, 6 feet by 10, about 2,400 pounds. It has been standing in the weather since 1948. First it gets released. 2 men with torches cut the rivet heads on the backside and drive the shanks through, and that is the only burning that happens on that plate all day, and it happens on the rivets and not on the plate. That distinction is the entire margin. Then the tongs come down on the crane. They land on the top edge. The jaws go over the plate about 8 inches, 1 arm each side, and a man on a ladder studies them and steps back. Then the crane takes up the slack. You can watch the grip happen. The arms draw together as the eye rises, slowly, and the jaws bite, and there is a moment where you can see the whole thing decide. 2,400 pounds of load turns into about 6,000 pounds of clamping force at the jaws because of the lever ratio, and nothing else in the system does anything at all. No power, no hydraulics, no lock. The plate comes off the wall and swings free. It travels maybe 80 feet and comes down flat on dunnage on a trailer bed. The crane lowers another 6 inches. The load comes off the eye. The arms open. The tongs go back for the next one. Elapsed time, once the crew has a rhythm, is about 4 minutes a plate. Now the same plate the old way. You burn 2 holes in it, near the top edge, about a foot in from each side. That takes a man with a torch maybe 6 minutes for the pair, and it costs you nothing in time you were not already spending. Which is exactly why everybody does it. Then you shackle through and lift and it goes on the same trailer. Faster, simpler, and every plate handled that way is now scrap. Because those 2 holes are not a cosmetic problem. A hole burned through a structural plate has a heat-affected zone around it, and no engineer is certifying that plate for structural reuse. And no buyer of reclaimed structural plate will take it. It goes for melt. $190 a ton against between $800 and $1,400. On that one plate, the difference is roughly $1,000. On 240 tons, it is $151,000. There is a thing to say here about why nobody was doing this, because it is not that the trade is stupid. Reusable structural plate is a specialist market, and it did not really exist in that region until about 10 years ago. Before that, salvage steel was melt steel, and if the only buyer is a foundry, then it genuinely does not matter what shape you deliver it in, and burning holes is free. The market changed. The habit did not. That is the ordinary way capabilities get missed. Not by anybody being foolish, but by a practice that was correct for 30 years, surviving 8 years past the point where it stopped being correct, because nobody re-examines a thing that is working. And re-examining it required owning the tool, and owning the tool required buying a joke at a farm sale for $35. One more number, and then we will leave the terminal. The crew rate that job at about a day and a half slower than they would have done it the old way. A day and a half of 4 men and a crane is somewhere around $6,000 of cost. They made $151,000. There is a proper caveat here, and this channel does not skip them. It does not work on everything. A plate that is painted with something you cannot identify, or that is pitted past a certain point, or that has no traceable origin, is scrap regardless of how you lift it, because the value is in the certification, and you cannot certify what you cannot establish. On that first terminal, a little over a third of the plate went for melt anyway. And it is slower. Tongs have to be placed, and the load has to be balanced, and you cannot swing a tonged load the way you can swing a shackled one, and on a job priced by the day, that is a real cost. But the arithmetic survives all of that comfortably, and by the 4th year, better than half the outfit's revenue came from plate recovery rather than demolition fees, which is a different business standing inside the old one. He bought a second pair in 2019 for 1.5-inch plate at a proper price this time from a dealer who knew what they were, and it cost him $4,100. That is the number that tells you what the first pair was worth, and he has said so himself. Now, the part that closes it. Those tongs were made in 1961 by the mill's own maintenance shop. They are not a manufactured product, and they never had a catalog number. Somebody in that shop drew them and cast them and stamped the thickness into the arm, and they did that because a mill that handles 2-inch plate all day needs a tool for it, and there was no reason to buy one. They were built for a material that was ordinary at the time. Then the material stopped being ordinary, and the mill closed, and the tongs went into a farm sale in a field in Missouri and stood against a hayrack all morning while 200 people took photographs of them because they look like a pair of pliers. And the entire reason they were worth something is that the world is still absolutely full of the stuff they were sized for, standing in the air, being taken down at a rate of a few thousand tons a year by people who were burning holes in it because they did not have the right tool and did not know there was one. There is a pattern in this trade that this particular lot illustrates better than anything I have come across, and it is worth setting out properly before we finish because it is not really about tongs. An object that has been scaled far outside its familiar size stops being read as a tool at all and starts being read as an image of a tool, which is a completely different thing and gets a completely different response from a crowd. Nobody in that field was assessing 3 tons of cast steel lifting gear against the work they had on next month. They were looking at an enormous pair of pliers, and the moment the shape resolved into something familiar, the assessment stopped. Because a joke is a complete experience in itself and does not leave anybody wanting to know more. That is why the photographs and the bidding were inversely related that morning, and it is why the pallet of certified chain immediately afterward, which is a boring object with tags on it that does the same job worse, made 80 times the money without anybody breaking stride. Chain does not look like anything. That is its commercial advantage. The second half of the pattern is the one that actually costs the trade money, and it has nothing to do with humor. A practice that was correct for 30 years will keep running for years after the conditions that made it correct have gone, because nobody re-examines a thing that appears to be working. Burning lifting holes in salvage plate was the right answer for decades, and it was the right answer for a reason that was solid and well understood, which is that the only buyer for reclaimed structural steel in that part of the country was a foundry, and a foundry does not care what shape the steel arrives in or how many holes are in it. Under those conditions, the hole is free and the speed is real, and any man who proposed a slower method would have been correctly told to stop wasting the crane. Then the reclaimed structural market appeared, quietly, over about 6 or 7 years, driven by lead times on new plate and by a certification framework that made reuse defensible to an engineer. The economics inverted completely, and the burning went on exactly as before, on job after job, because it was not a decision anybody was making anymore. It was simply how plate came off a building. You do not rederive your working method every morning. Nobody could function that way, which means that the moments when a method actually does get rederived are almost always accidents, and they tend to be triggered by an object rather than by an argument, because an object sitting in your yard asks a question every time you walk past it in a way that a good idea never does. Ardell Buskirk did not sit down one evening and reason his way from market conditions to lifting practice and thence to the conclusion that he needed tongs. He bought a funny-looking thing for $35 because the stamp on the arm said a number he recognized from his own working week, and then it stood in his yard for 4 months being visible, and somewhere in the 4th month the two halves came together. That is not a flattering description of how insight works, and he does not claim it is. It is, though, the honest one, and it is the reason a channel about this trade is worth making, because the useful lesson is not be clever, it is own the thing long enough for it to ask you the question. One practical footnote because people in the trade ask about it every time this comes up. Tongs of this kind are not certified lifting gear in the modern sense and cannot be made so. There is no plate, no maker, no test certificate, and no serial number, and that means the yard had to have them examined and rated by a competent person and entered on its own thorough examination schedule, which cost a few $100s and takes a morning twice a year. That is a real cost and a real piece of paperwork, and it is not optional. It is also the single most common reason people give for not bothering. A tool with no paperwork looks like a liability, and for most yards it genuinely is, because most yards do not have enough of that work to justify the schedule. The difference in this case is volume. If you are taking down 2-inch plate every month, the examination cost disappears into the first lift of the first job, and after that, it is free. Which is another way of saying the same thing this whole story keeps saying. The tool was not valuable in general. It was valuable to one specific person doing one specific kind of work who happened to be standing in the right field. The man in the green quilted jacket was right that they are the world's biggest pair of pliers. He was wrong about the toolbox. They do not need one. They live outside, chained to a rack in a salvage yard north of Chillicothe, and they are used most weeks, and the only maintenance they have had in 64 years is paint. There is nothing in them to break.